Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Simone. I'm Community Manager with the OED team, and I'm delighted to be here with Dr. Danica Salazar and Mr. Kingsley Ugwuanyi. So now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Danica Salazar so she can begin her presentation. So Danica, it's over to you.
Thank you, Simone. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Danica Salazar. I'm World English Editor for the Oxford English Dictionary, based here in Oxford University Press. You may all have heard of something very exciting that happened in the OED in January 2020. On this day, we published 29 new words from Nigerian English. Now, these additions to the dictionary attracted a considerable amount of attention in the news media and in social media, not only in Nigeria, but even beyond. And though the reaction to the Nigerian English update has been largely positive, it has also raised many questions about the OED and its coverage of world Englishes, questions which I hope to answer in today's webinar with the help of our Nigerian consultant, Kingsley Ugwuanyi. Now, the first and most basic among these questions is, what is the OED? The key thing to know about it is that the OED is an historical dictionary. So unlike most dictionaries which focus on current meanings of words, the OED also shows the history of individual words, traced through quotations taken from written examples of authentic language use. The latest edition of the OED is accessible through OED Online, where updates are published quarterly. Another fundamental question is, what do we mean by world Englishes? In the OED, we take world Englishes to mean those localized or indigenized varieties of English spoken throughout the world by people of diverse cultural backgrounds in a wide range of social linguistic contexts. On this map, you can see in dark blue those countries where English is spoken as a first language, and in light blue, those where English is spoken as a second language. Strictly speaking, all the varieties spoken in these places can be considered world varieties of English, but in the OED, when we talk about world Englishes, we refer to varieties other than standard British and American English, which are the two major varieties that have always been considered core English by most dictionaries. But all other varieties, Canadian English, Australian English, Nigerian, Jamaican, Singapore, Indian, Irish, African American, vernacular English, etc., are within the scope of world Englishes in the OED. Now, on the questions of Pidgins and Creoles, those Pidgins and Creoles based on English are not included since the OED treats them as separate languages. Just as other languages like French and Latin, they can be a source of borrowings into English, but they are not varieties of English themselves. So, for example, a word such as Seth is in the OED because it was borrowed into English from Nigerian Pidgin English, though the Pidgin word itself may have ultimately come from the English word safe. And another question may be, why is the OED paying so much attention to world Englishes now? Now, the answer to that is it's not just now that OED is including world English words. Contrary to some reports, the 29 words in the Nigerian English update are not the first Nigerian words to make it into the OED. They join dozens of others that have been added through the years. I always like to give the example of this OED entry for Abaka, which appears on page 5 of the 1884 A to Ant fascicle of the OED, the very first incarnation of the dictionary. Mostly because this lets me say that Philippine English, my native variety, has been represented in the OED from the very first pages of its very first installment. But there is something else that's interesting about it. If you actually look at the entry, it is obvious that Abaka's Philippineness is peripheral to the entry, and that the word made it into the dictionary by virtue of its significance to British industry, being at the time a material used in making everyday objects used in Britain. Now, to be fair to James Murray, the chief editor of this fascicle, and his colleagues, the editorial choices were limited by the chiefly British and American research sources they had access to in Oxford during their time. These limitations led to a certain bias in the OED towards loanwords relating to flora, fauna, ethnic groups, and other items of mostly historical and anthropological interest. However, we are all aware that there has been a paradigm shift in mainstream linguistics in the 20th century. All forms of language are now given equal value, at least in theory. We now believe that linguistic variation is a natural consequence of cultural diversity, that a language such as English that has been transplanted into new environments tends to adapt to these environments, that national or regional varieties of languages serve to express national or regional identities. We live in a post-imperialist world where the globalization of English is an accepted fact. The OED, of course, has had to respond to this paradigm shift, and as early as in a 1986 article, Edmund Weiner, one of the chief editors of the OED's 1989 second edition, acknowledged the ad hoc treatment of regional English items in the first edition and its subsequent supplements, and discussed possible ways of applying a more articulated policy in the second edition. And finally, in 2000, with the launch of the third edition, then chief editor John Simpson explicitly recognized the status of English as a world language and the relegation of British English from being the only standard to being one of many to be covered by the dictionary. I think the Financial Times put it best in a 2016 article when it said, the OED finds itself in the curious position of being a national institution called upon almost by default to assume the role of a global one. And now I'm going to spend the rest of my time in this presentation showing you how we are rising to this challenge. The goal that we're currently pursuing is providing balanced, representative, and authentic coverage of world Englishes. We try to do this in a variety of ways. First, in our word selection. We no longer have the same limitations faced by editors of earlier editions of the OED. The internet has given us wider access to non-UK and non-US sources of linguistic evidence. We can now use our massive in-house language corpora with its variety-specific segments to generate frequency counts that help us prioritize emerging World English words for inclusion. We can also use other World English corpora available, such as the Globe Corpus. We can consult the increasingly large body of scholarly work on World English lexis. We can collaborate with a network of consultants working on various World English varieties. We can launch crowdsourcing initiatives in order to ask for word suggestions from the various speakers of World Englishes themselves. All of these new research resources enable us to shift our attention towards more contemporary lexis and mechanisms of lexical innovation beyond the simple borrowing of exotic terms. So we can include strategies of word creation such as semantic change, fossilization, loan translation, loan blending, conversion from one part of speech to another, affixation, clipping, compounding. So on this slide are just some examples of this type of vocabulary from the recent Nigerian update. And our new research tools have also allowed us to add more words from semantic fields that are of particular interest to actual speakers of World English varieties, not just to British or American lexicographers or linguistic anthropologists looking at the variety from an outsider perspective. We have recently included more words from such culturally specific domains as food and drink, places to eat, informal modes of transport, and one that I find particularly fascinating, kidship terms. Lexical items that may be considered peripheral in standard British English and forms no part of the vocabulary of British English speakers are also given space in the OED. For instance, the calamansi, probably known only to Brits and Americans as a decorative plant with orange fruits sometimes sold at IKEA, is to Filipinos a green fruit that is essential to their cooking as the lemon is here. Now, Brits or Americans have no need to know what an HDB is unless they happen to live in Singapore, where it's as ubiquitous as the word flat is here. The OED has also formulated specific pronunciation models for World English varieties, which can all be consulted on the OED website. We use these models to provide variety-specific IPA transcriptions for World English items, accompanied by recorded audio pronunciations. So if you have, say, a Nigerian English word like mamaput, which by the way means a street vendor selling cooked food from a hand cart or stall, you get the IPA transcriptions and audio pronunciations in British and American English as a standard for all OED entries apart from obsolete ones, but you also get the IPA transcription in West African English and hear the word being pronounced in a West African accent. So let's just try that now. So if you're using the OED, you have to click these blue buttons here, but on this slide, I will click here just to give you an idea.
Mama put. Mama put.
Right. So we also think it is important for World English words in the dictionary to be illustrated by quotations from works written by speakers of the varieties in question and published in their place of origin. See, for instance, this entry for the Nigerian word buka, which refers to a roadside restaurant or street food stall. You can see that in this case, all the quotations come from Nigerian sources, which we now have greater access to thanks to online digital databases such as Google Books and Lexis, and even social media sites such as Twitter, which we now also quote in the OED. In this entry, we quote books by Nigerian authors and tweets by actual Nigerians using the word buka in their most typical context of local use. Moving World Englishes from the periphery to the center in the OED entails not just documenting their idiosyncratic lexicons. It also means using more World English sources to illustrate general English words. In other words, if works of classic English literature in the most important British and American newspapers appear regularly in our quotation paragraphs to show the development of everyday English words, then why not the works of post-colonial writers in English? Why not newspapers read in other parts of the English-speaking world? We aim to do this by adding more and more World English publications to the OED reading program, which is now our now digital collection of sentences or short extracts drawn from a huge variety of writing by volunteer readers. We also aim to make the labeling of entries more useful and to provide more discursive information. See, for instance, this unrevised entry for jeepney, with really sparse information that does not tell the reader much about the jeepney's significance in Philippine transport. Compare that to this new entry for sisig, which includes not just a discursive label relating it to Filipino cookery, but also an additional small type note that tells the reader more about the origins of the dish, its possible variations, when it is eaten, and even cross-refers to the Filipino food custom of pulutan, for which the OED also has an entry. And the last question I would like to address is, what is the significance of the OED's improving its coverage of World Englishes to people who use a dictionary for research? Now, the answer to this lies in new ways of accessing the dictionary. The OED's digital format has taken away the restrictions of alphabetization and enabled its users to explore the dictionary in ways beyond looking up individual words. John Simpson noted in 2013 how advances in computational lexicography have shifted the focus of interest from single word lookups to more general investigations of linguistic trends. The OED's timeline feature, for instance, enables a user to generate graphs that show the number of words first recorded by the OED with different time periods, which can be limited by various subject, region, and origin categories. The graph here on this slide illustrates the patterns of borrowing from Niger-Congo languages throughout 10 centuries of the history of the English language, which should be of interest to researchers of African Englishes. With this change in how users access the content of the OED, achieving coverage of a World English variety that is comprehensive enough to clearly show the patterns of lexical innovation throughout its history is becoming more important than the inclusion of any single word. It is apparent that a more wide-ranging selection of vocabulary that reflects the actual lexical creativity of World English users matters more and is much more achievable for us than any possible notion of completeness. And it really strikes me that when people find out about new World English additions to the OED, they're excited about individual words being added, but it's just not that is exciting. What's most exciting is what these words tell us about the varieties themselves and the people who use them. There are relatively fewer studies on World English vocabulary because lexical studies require massive corpora, which currently are unavailable for varieties other than British and American English. This is a research gap that the OED can help fill. The OED is more than just a dictionary. It's a huge and parallel depository of diachronic linguistic data. And by adding new words and revising old entries for World English words, the OED is increasing the quantity and further improving the quality of the lexical data that it contains for World Englishes, so that it can be an even bigger, even more balanced, even more representative, and even more reliable data set that can help researchers answer a variety of questions on how English is used by different communities across the globe. So it can help answer questions like, is this word really a coinage in my variety or a preserved archaic use? A simple OED lookup can verify this. What are the dominant semantic fields in a variety and what do they say about the specific cultural and societal concerns of this community? For example, circling back to kinship terms, the OED's inclusion of such terms in Asian varieties of English show how the speech etiquette of Asian cultures features a complex system of kinship terms and terms of address in which age, gender, status, and family relationships are marked by highly specific vocabulary with no direct equivalence in English. So this lexical gap is filled by borrowing such words from local languages or adapting existing English words. And the OED can also help answer the question of how the historical links between different geographical areas manifest in lexical terms. For instance, what are the lexical commonalities between West African Englishes, Caribbean Englishes, and African American Vernacular English? We can also ask which substrate languages most influence a variety. During which time periods have there been more contact between English and a certain substrate language? What are the mechanisms of lexical innovation that characterize a specific variety? How have spelling conventions changed for certain World English words? What are the similarities and differences between varieties with regard to pronunciations? And the OED can also provide insight not just in lexical history, but history in general. I remember once writing an article about Philippine political history and how it is reflected in the Philippine English words in the dictionary. Indeed, the OED's World English content can have research applications not just in linguistics, but also in anthropology, history, cultural studies, literary studies, and many other fields. So these are the principles that we follow in our current World English work, which has been applied to these varieties in the past few years. These varieties have been selected on the basis of need, meaning that we have identified them as particularly underrepresented in the OED, and also on the basis of the availability of resources, meaning we have found corpora, databases, dictionaries, and external consultants that could support our work on each variety. And it's here that I would like to say that if you are working on a variety that you think should be covered by the OED, please do get in touch with us. We are currently working on an online platform where academic researchers can communicate directly with the OED. And if you are a researcher working on a variety or several varieties of English and you have any suggestions in any aspect of our World English work or any ideas for collaboration, do contact me. The platform is not live yet, but if you express interest in getting involved, we'll get in touch with you when it's up and running. And at this point, I would also like to highlight the absolutely crucial role played by our native speaker consultants in ensuring the accuracy and representativeness of our World English entries. So I will now hand over to our Nigerian English consultant, Kingsley Ugwuanyi, to discuss his experience working with the OED on the Nigerian English update. Over to you, Kingsley.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Salazar, for that the wide-ranging topics you've covered in your presentation. I would like to begin by reflecting on the nature of the role I played in the Nigerian English project. Well, I played and may still be playing. Well, generally speaking, my role involved providing the Nigerian context to the words under consideration. I drew from my experience as a Nigerian trained linguist researching Nigerian English and a native speaker of Nigerian English in providing sociocultural and sociolinguistic information on how the candidate words are being used in Nigeria. Right, next. Right, for instance, you would see the word there in your screen is the word egusi, which you see has three senses, so to speak. So while we were considering the senses of this word and the definitions, there was a lot of going back and forth between the editors and myself regarding the Nigerian English word, egusi. The first definition has something like a stew, with emphasis on stew there, made with ground melon seeds. I immediately pointed out to the editors that egusi is not stew per se, but a kind of soup. In fairness to the editors, I fully understand why they thought it was stew. For instance, the English soup is usually watery. The OED, for instance, defines soup as a liquid dish. As a result, they must have been led to think that since egusi is usually thick, it must be stew and not soup. Our discussion on egusi dragged on until one of the editors decided to order egusi from an African restaurant to see and possibly taste it. Moreover, I also pointed out that it would sound strange to most Nigerians since many of them refer to the dish as a goosey soup and never as a goosey stew. Thereafter, we all agreed that the word would be appropriately described as soup, not stew. And so, as you've seen the definition in your screen. So that was the kind of a role I played. Additionally, I also worked with the pronunciations editors to help with the phonological realizations of some of the words which do not already exist in English. Following this, a pronunciation model for West African English was developed, and this can easily be found on the OED website. Let me use this opportunity to point out that researchers interested in the phonology of New Englishes will find the West African pronunciation model extremely resourceful. Looking at the Nigerian English added in the OED, you would notice that some of them are labeled West African because they are also in use in other West African countries or West African English-speaking countries. Research evidence has demonstrated that there is an affinity between West African English varieties, particularly between Nigerian English and Ghanaian English. And the reasons are obvious. There's a lot of socio-cultural, even economic relationship between Nigeria and Ghana. Right. I must also remark that having been mostly involved in sociolinguistic and applied linguistic research, working with the expert team of OED editors at the OED afforded me the chance to reflect on the lexicographical issues and challenges of non-native varieties of English, particularly Nigerian English. All right, next. I'll briefly talk about what I think the addition of the Nigerian English words in the OED mean for the overall development of Nigerian English as a distinctive variety of English. But before talking about what this addition means to Nigerian English or development of English in Nigeria, I think it's important to say what it means to English as a language, generally speaking. Like the OED stated in the release notes, this addition indicates that Nigerians, and that's quoting OED release note verbatim, Nigerians have made and are continuing to make a unique and distinctive contribution to English as a global language. That is, Nigeria and Nigerian English or Nigerian English is giving back to English. As I argued in the conversation publication, which you can see on the screen there, this is one of the factors that make English a truly global language, that ability to include words from a variety of languages. So one way English retains its dominance as a world language is by adding new words and senses, not just from other English varieties, but from virtually all languages of the world. I'll give you an instance. English has had the word postpone since the late 15th century, but it seems it was through Indian English that its opposite, prepone, entered English in current use during the 20th century. Similarly, Nigerian English is reintroducing the verb meaning of the word, the verb meaning of barb, which is a back formation from the word barber. Barb means now to have a haircut or to have your hair cut. Right. This word existed in 16th century British English, but it is today currently being reintroduced as a verb into British English or into English more generally through Nigerian English. So moving on, I consider this addition an indication that Nigerian English has fully come of age. It shows that Nigerians are radically appropriating English and taking ownership of it. As the foremost Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe put it, Nigerians are making English carry the full weight of their experience. The next one. Right, so the OED is aiming to use the same linguistic ideology that has made dictionaries such an effective tool in the promotion of the standard to change the way previously marginalized varieties are perceived. Documenting words from these varieties in a dictionary such as the OED serves as a strong argument for the recognition of their own separate norms, which can be considered equal to those of standard British and American English. It also gives speakers of these varieties the assurance that the English they use is legitimate and helps them recognize themselves as members of a distinctive language community. As Susan Butler, the pioneer editor of Macquarie Dictionary of Australian English, put it in 1997, being able to say that your words are in a dictionary in general has more effect on the public perception of the validity of a variety than many words spent on linguistic theorizing. So while it is good we theorize as linguists, as researchers, I mean, the appearance and the inclusion of these words in the dictionary might mean more to the public. The OED's reputation as a linguistic authority can turn it into an effective instrument for promoting diversity. The OED can therefore bring varieties formerly in the periphery into the center by recognizing the plurality of centers of English. So in conclusion, I am of the view that by adding these words from a range of varieties of English in the outer circle, that is to use Kachru's term, such as Nigeria, India, the Philippines, the OED is indeed recognizing that English has become a global language and using its institutional prestige to promote the development of these hitherto periphery varieties of English. So at this point, I would like to hand over to Dr. Danica Salazar to wrap up.
Right. Thank you so much, Kingsley. So we are concluding here, but I would just like to say that there is definitely still room for critique, for new ideas, for research resources and technologies, and for new ways to exploit the vast amount of data stored in the OED. World Englishes provide particularly fertile ground for innovation in the OED, as they bring up a variety of research questions that push us to re-examine our practices and policies. And for this, we need your help. We have just recently launched an appeal to researchers to help us shape the future of World Englishes in the OED. Helping the OED can be as simple as taking part in a World Englishes survey, which can be accessed through the link on this slide. So thank you very much for your attention, and I would love to hear your questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Danica, and thank you very much, Kingsley. This was very interesting. And yes, we do have a few questions that we've got already. I'm going to start with the first one on the chat. So the question is, there were 2 blog posts about the language of coronavirus on the OED blog recently. Have you been monitoring the way the coronavirus has been spoken about in different varieties of English too, or only in British English so far?
That's a great question, and for which I actually have some very interesting answers. And I guess it's a question that really must be asked, given these times that we're living in. And I actually, as I said, I actually have some answers there, because we have been monitoring the way coronavirus is being talked about, not just in English in general, but also in different varieties of English. As I said, the times we're living in are quite extraordinary for many reasons, but from a linguistic perspective, it's extraordinary in that the entire global conversation is focused on just this one specific subject. So everyone in the English-speaking world, no matter where they are, is being required really to adapt the way they talk all at the same time as a response to the same social pressures that everyone is experiencing. So when we went into our corpus data for March and compared the most frequently used words in different varieties of English, Although we observed many of the same keywords like, of course, coronavirus, COVID-19, pandemic, hand sanitizer, face masks, self-isolation, quarantine. We also saw some very interesting differences. I mean, even this thing we're all experiencing right now of staying at home so as not to spread the virus, we call it lockdown here in the UK, but in the US, they call it shelter in place. In Singapore, it's called circuit breaker, which apparently is a finance term. So I guess it makes sense for a business hub such as Singapore. Southeast Asians seem to like initialisms and acronyms a lot. So Filipinos call it ECQ for Enhanced Community Quarantine. Malaysians use MCO for Movement Control Order. In the UK, people say frontline workers, but in the Philippines, they say frontliners. Everyone uses PPE for personal protective equipment, but in the Philippines, PPE is used as a count noun, so we say PPEs. Curiously, so there are several interesting trends, and I'm actually just finishing writing a blog post on this subject, so it should come out on the OED's public pages soon. So please do check it out when it comes out.
Thank you, Danica. The next one I've got here is great presentation. How consistent and truly Nigerian are the word pronunciations as they appear in the OED?
Well, we would maybe add, since Kingsley has been directly involved in this, could answer that question.
Right. I would say that generally speaking, now some of these words are already exist in English. For instance, I was just giving an example with the Nigerian English word "bab," which is an English word, or even next tomorrow, which means the day after tomorrow in Nigerian English, because next and tomorrow are already existing Nigerian English words. Already existing English words in the standard varieties. Now, there are not directly Nigerian pronunciations for this, but for some other words like egusi, like okada, like Kannywood, those words that are specifically Nigerian may have been derived from indigenous Nigerian languages. Their pronunciations were generally Nigerian.
Thank you, Kingsley. We've got some people with their hands raised as well. Now I'm unmuting Christopher Okolo.
Hi. Thank you very much, Danica and Kingsley, for the nice presentation. I am an academic staff at Ahmadu University and a doctoral researcher at University of Bonn in Germany. I have two questions. Some of these Nigerian words added to the OED were already categorized or classified in a unique category called Pidgin English, as it's called in Nigeria. And these are referred or seen as vernacular English. So do you think that these words will now be viewed or now be accepted as proper English words and no longer as vernacular? And do you also think that the world would now accept those words, and then we will now see them not only in literary works like novels and poems, but also in academic and scholarly publication like doctoral theses or journal publications? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. Well, as I mentioned towards the beginning of this talk, so we consider Pidgin Englishes, including Nigerian Pidgin English, to be a separate language from English. So the OED naturally covers the English language, and Nigerian Pidgin English, although it is based on English, it is evolved as a separate language. So it can be a source of borrowings of words from Nigerian Pidgin English into English. So for instance, I gave the example of safe, which originally was an English word safe that then became a Nigerian Pidgin English word which was later on borrowed again into English, and that borrowing is what we reflect in the OED when we added the word "sef." So about people recognizing the words coming from Pidgin English and being borrowed into English, we really can't say that. I think there is this general belief that as soon as a word is published in the OED, then that means that everyone at that very moment will be using the words in formal context. The OED is there to record actual usage of words and not to, what it does is record and describe the usage of words, but not dictate. So I cannot predict whether these words will be used in formal context. Maybe some of them, so for instance, like "sef," because of the nature of this word, it's a much more oral discourse marker. So it's not very likely that it's going to be used in academic writing. So it really depends on the nature of the word and what people decide to do with it. So I guess the OED has some influence in that people become more aware of the existence of these words, especially outside of Nigeria. But in whether they're going to use it more or in what context they're going to use it, that really depends on each word, and that depends on what people decide to do.
Right. If I could just
Thank
add
you,
a quick
Danica.
one to that. That these words are borrowed. One more reason why these words, like Danica has just mentioned, is that these words appear in English discourse, in English texts. So the evidence of these words being in use was not obtained from pidgin text, so to speak. Likewise, some of the words added have origin in Igbo or Hausa or Yoruba, which are indigenous Nigerian languages. So Oxford OED doesn't necessarily go to Igbo texts or Yoruba texts to obtain these words. But once these words begin to appear in English text, then in a sense they have become part of English.
Thank you, Kingsley.
Yeah.
Another question we've got from the chat is, what are the exact criteria for inclusion of variety-specific vocabulary?
Well, so we use different criteria for the selection of words. One of them is frequency, but we cannot say that there is a specific frequency threshold that. So we consult language corpora and databases of English texts, but we don't say that, oh, a word has to have appeared X number of times, because it really depends on what kind of word it is and in which places we expect to see them. But frequency is one of the criteria for selection and also for prioritization of words. But we also look at salience. So for instance, and whether something looks like it is of a particular cultural or social significance in the variety. As a rule of thumb, we also want to prioritize words that have shown a certain longevity, so that has been around for a few years of usage. But that also depends on the word, because some words are relatively young but have had so much social impact that we just can't ignore them, and they just need to go into the dictionary immediately. So I would say that our main criteria is frequency, salience, and longevity of the words.
Thank you, Danica. Next question. Would the OED consider updating terms such as archaism that serve as valued judgments of the varieties and their validity? So, Sharia Al-Gama, I'm unmuting you so you can confirm if this is really what you were asking.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much for a very lovely presentation. You can hear me, right?
Yes,
Yes.
perfectly.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you to both of you. My question was more to do with in varieties of English research, we constantly interact with the terms with with the terms that we use to describe the varieties or their features, and sometimes, for instance, archaism could mean as the idea of something being outdated in a variety, of a word being outdated, and there have been like several people who wrote about this. They give alternatives and so on. And I was just wondering whether the OED would consider updating the terms or the labels that you use.
Yes, that I mean the part of the OED's work is checking whether our usage information is accurate. And in fact, there have been some cases where some words have needed to be revised because we found out we've labeled it as obsolete, or archaic, but because it is in British English, but it turns out that it is still current in a certain variety of English, meaning that the word was brought to that place by the British when English or first arrived in that area, and then they stopped using the word, and that's what's recorded in the OED. But then it turns out, as we did further research, that the word is still being used by either in India or in Nigeria, wherever, and we find current evidence of the word being used in those places. So then we update these words and say, oh, in fact, it's not. So we remove the obsolete label and then say this word is now chiefly used in this particular variety. So we do update our information in that way.
Thank you, Danica. I'm going to unmute Catherine Sangster. I believe you've got a comment to make.
Oh, great. Great.
Oh, hi there. Sorry, I wasn't expecting to speak, but I just there was a question about 5 or 6 questions back about the pronunciations, which is my department, in case those who don't know me. We just wanted to add the information which was possibly pertinent to that question, that the voice actor who we used to make the recordings that you hear when you listen to the Nigerian English was a speaker of Nigerian English, and his other language was Yoruba, in case that was relevant. Thanks. It's been a great presentation. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Another question from the chat. How are additional senses to core lexical items added and categorized? For example, to chop with the additional senses of to eat in West African varieties and to stamp in Southeast Asian varieties.
So usually, well, of course, the basic words like chop has been in the OED since then. These type of words have been in the OED since the 19th century because they are, core English words. But as we proceed with our work on reviewing particular varieties of English, and if we find that a new sense of this word has developed in a certain variety, and we still don't have it recorded in the OED, then we will add it as a new addition to the entry, as a new. Either we revise the existing definition to include this new sense, or we add a new sense to the same entry. So we do include those type of updates when we do work on a variety. So a good example is the word chop in Nigerian English, which we found has developed this other sense of to defraud or to embezzle money. So of course we've always had chop in its more general senses in the OED, but we didn't have this Nigerian sense. So we did the research to be able to add that new sense.
Thank you, Danica. I'm now going to unmute Bernard Sabiti. Bernard, please, you can ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for a great presentation. My name is Bernard Sabiti. I'm from Uganda, which means I speak Ugandan English. and I've written a small book about that. You may want to look it up sometime. I just wanted to ask, I had sent in a question via email, probably you have not yet seen it, but it also had to do with the criteria of including what in the OED. And for me, my question is really around the fact that sometimes the countries themselves can be rather complex internally, to the point that what might be a word in one part of the country might actually be something different in the other part of that same country. And probably some people may not even have the same understanding of the word. So when you say the language is Nigerian English or Ugandan English, how do you take care of those internal complexities, cultural, linguistic, indigenous languages, and which influence these Englishes? Yeah, if you could say something about that. Thanks.
Yeah, can I
Yes.
quickly? Right. Yes. Saviti, that's a very interesting observation. Yes, within, for instance, the Nigerian example, Nigeria is a country of over 200 million people and has over 500 indigenous languages, apart from English. So you would expect a lot of internal variation. So that even when you talk about Nigerian English, a lot of people tend to argue what is really Nigerian, when you can talk about Southern English or Yoruba English or Northern English or Hausa English, so to speak. Right. So these are concerns, but during selection, you will still find that the words selected are words that tend not to be regionalized. There are several words also. So one of the criteria also which we may need to have is the spread. The spread of the word is also one of the things considered, so that you wouldn't take a word that is, so for instance, if the evidence in the corpus shows that I think Danica would talk more about that. If that evidence shows that these words, yes, is very popular, but is used only in one region or in one state, right? It may not readily be included. But even though a word may be more popularly used, for instance, the word "damfo," which was included in the English dictionary, tends to be more popular in the southern part, particularly Lagos. All right, but because Lagos is the commercial hub of the country, for instance, you would notice that this word begins to spread because, I mean, Lagos is a center in Nigeria, for instance. So a lot of people travel to Lagos and this word tend to spread. Even though you will see that there's that tendency for this word to be in greater use around the Lagos region, the Lagos area, or the southern area. There is that spread. So spread is also one of the factors that is considered.
Yeah, just if I could just add to that, yeah, I am also very aware of the internal variation within national varieties of English. So Kingsley talked about there being, hundreds of millions of people in Nigeria with hundreds of different native languages, and the same goes with the Philippines. So hundreds of millions of people with hundreds of languages, and naturally, you can expect some variation with those kinds of demographics. But the thing with writing a dictionary is that you have also certain limitations to what you can do. So we are, dictionaries are written by people with limitations on the time and resources that they have. So what we need to do with the OED is to prioritize certain words, and at the moment in this stage of our World English work, we try to prioritize words that have, as Kingsley said, a more a wider spread of usage rather than those that are specifically to smaller regions. Although sometimes there are words that, as Kingsley said, have originated from a specific place and then spread wider out. But I like to say that that's more of a way to manage our work and make sure that we have that we select words that will be of interest to a greater number of people speaking Nigerian English or whatever variety. But this is not at all a comment on whether a word is valid or worthy of inclusion in the OED. And I'm hoping, because I find this variation absolutely fascinating. So I'm hoping that as our research continues, as our work continues, and our ways of displaying information in the OED becomes even more complex and sophisticated, we will at one point find a way to also look more closely at these variations and reflect them even more in the dictionary. So I'm just trying to say that internal variation is something that's absolutely worth keeping in mind, and that
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you both. I'm now unmuting Frank Steve Nankep-Nana. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, I'm Franz Chief Nankep. I'm studying Master English Speaking Cultures in the University of Bremen in Germany. My question is, when we talk, first I will try to explain my question first. When we talk about language variation, there are many mechanisms such as neologism in terms of structure, neologism in terms of meaning. There are some shifts in pronunciation. So my question is, as far as English variation particularly is concerned, which of those three mechanisms would impact, would more impact the process of variation creation in terms of English variation? Neologism in terms of structure, or neologism in terms of meaning, or just the change in pronunciation? Thank you.
I would say that a combination of all those factors will have an impact. I mean, variation manifests itself because what happens in places where World Englishes are spoken is this people speakers of World Englishes tend to be highly multilingual and multicultural. So what happens is there's a lot of contact between English and various languages, and this cross-linguistic lexical influence manifests itself in a variety of ways. So that can be seen in changes to pronunciation, the creation of new words, borrowing from between languages. So all of those things result in the changes in vocabulary that we record in the OED. I mean, I don't think I can pinpoint any specific mechanism of lexical innovation that
Yeah,
would be.
yeah. If I would just add a note there, while there's an interaction of these dimensions of variation, as you've pointed out, I would say that, of course, we all know that the most obvious variation in English is in terms of pronunciation. You hear my pronunciation, you know my accent is Nigerian. You hear different people who have asked questions on this platform, you hear different accents, so to speak. So that's the most obvious manifestation of this variation. However, it seems to me that the one that will play more that might have more impact in terms of inclusion, because OED would not want to have 10 variations of the pronunciations of the word transport, for example. The way transport is pronounced in Nigeria or in India or in the UK or in the US and in everywhere the word is pronounced. But then if you find a variation in meaning, in one very significant meaning or senses of the word transport, OED is more likely to capture that lexical variation, that meaning variation, much more than it would capture accentual variation. While accentual variation is the most obvious, now this OED tends to capture more the lexical extension or the semantic extensions that would happen and the neologisms that come with that. I think that's that seems to me what the questioner seems to want to hear.
Was that the question? Because that what Kingsley said obviously just applies to the OED. I thought the question was about the English language in general. So, well, in short, if you were referring to the English language in general, that was my answer, and Kingsley's answer was more focused on the OED. So I totally agree. I totally agree with what you said.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, both. So I'm now going to unmute Temitope Dorcas. Please go ahead and ask your question.
My name is Temitope Dorcas Adetuishi. I'm Nigerian. I'm living in France now, and I got this invitation via European Master in Lexicography. So my contribution, I would just want to say that issue of word pronunciation has been addressed. I would just like to add that etymology of words too is important, since we do not have many specialized dictionaries for OED, for these language variations yet. I would say the lexicographical reference work that will be prepared should be at least all encompassing to an extent, in that it includes pronunciation, etymology. And my question, I added like an example of from Yoruba, from Nigerian Pidgin English, Pikin and Sabi. Pikin and Sabi emanate from Portuguese Saber and Pequeno. And this started during the slave trade. So if there can be a short information on how these words enter English, it will be a good idea. Like, it will give a kind of education to dictionary users on word etymology.
Mama put.
Well, yeah, actually, that's a good point. But that I just like to let you know that etymological information is part of all OED entries. So I just went back to my slide on Buka just to show that we do include etymological information. So you can see at the just underneath the head word, there's a section called etymology, where it shows that the word Buka comes from either Yoruba or Hausa. So all of the entries in the OED have this information.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Danica. I'm now going to unmute Sally Idham. Sally, please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Danica Salazar and Kingsley. My name is Sally Dehen, and I have a question. The fact, for example, these new Nigerian English, the Englishes that have been put into the Oxford English Dictionary, does it mean that, for example, let's take the word Ember Month. It's known that when people use it, at least informally, there are different types of, they use different spellings. So my question is this: for the fact that it's been added into the Oxford English Dictionary, does it mean that when you use them now, we all have to take the meaning in the dictionary or adopt the meaning, the way it's written in the dictionary, and not the normal informal way we kind of use it? I don't know if you understand.
All right. Yeah, I think I understand, and I will attempt to respond to that quickly. Right now, as Danica has mentioned earlier, OED is not prescriptive, so it doesn't necessarily prescribe. If you look at Buka, which I think is still on your screen, if you look at Buka, you will see that there are spelling variations. You see Buka with double K, for instance. So when a spelling variation is very widely used, the OED actually also captures that, right? While I would actually acknowledge that with OED adding Embermond, for instance, and you will see that there are other spelling. If you open Embermond, I just opened it now, and you'll find that there are other spelling variations as well. There is the Ember, EMBA, which is also captured there. So even though the first one is EMBER, which is to say that that is more widely used, but the variation EMBA is still there. So these spelling variations are there, and when they are very widespread, the variation is widespread, or ED also captures them. So, however, it might mean that because people would readily find the EMBER as the first word and it's the first variation in OED, there may be that tendency for people to tend to use these other variation as the most popular. But also, OED also included it as the first one because it is the most popular already in use.
Okay, so thank you. I think I understand. So the more people use the ones written in the dictionary, the more the variations are reduced. Like, I think that's what you're saying, yeah?
Well, we cannot predict what would happen, but OED actually is not recommending, or it's not prescribing people to use this. OED is actually acknowledging that the first one there you find there is the most popular. So OED just describes what it has been found. So it's been found that the EMBER is more popular, but EMBA is also a variation. That's why it is captured.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Kingsley. I'm now unmuting Uchenna Oyale.
Hello, my name is Uchenna Oyale. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, and I teach in the Department of English, University of Abuja. I have two quick questions and an observation. The first question has to do with the slide on recent and upcoming World English projects, where you gave a list of different national Englishes, and I was kind of confused when I saw East African, and I was wondering, do we not have country-specific varieties in East Africa? That's the first question. The second one has to do with egusi soup that Kingsley talked about. He talked about how the word soup was negotiated. Initially stew was used, and then he insisted, and they went to the field and discovered that better expression to use. But my question then is the understanding of soup in Nigerian English the same as it is in, say, British English? Is there no kind of Nigerianized understanding of the word soup? And then lastly, we still go back to a question that has been mentioned by about 3 speakers, the pronunciation of these words. I talked specifically about mama put. I actually wanted to ask about the background of the people or persons that provide those pronunciation, and I was kind of surprised that a Yoruba person provided mama put, because to me mama put sounds like a direct address to the seller to put the food in the plate or wherever. But mama put refers to the whole concept of a food vendor. So I think the emphasis should be, the stress should be on the second syllable of mama and not mama, but mama. I don't know, that's my observation. You might want to look more into this. Thank you.
Okay, so let me take the first question about,
Okay.
Wait, what was it about?
East African.
East
African.
East African.
Yeah.
So East Africa, yes, it is. So on that slide, when we say East African English, we specifically mean looking at words from Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. But I've put East African English. It should be East African Englishes actually on the slide, because we're going to be working on all these 3 countries together. but it depends on each individual word. If we find a word that's only used in Kenya, then we will label it as Kenyan. And if it's specific to Uganda, we'll only label it as Ugandan. But if we see that the word is used throughout the whole region, then we will label it East African.
Well,
Yes,
I just made the observation because we have countries mentioned, and then we have a region mentioned last, so I got confused.
Yeah, but
right. Just to clarify, also, you would notice even though West African is not there, as you see, that some of the words, you would added as Nigerian English actually labeled West African English. In fact, that's one area of contention while we were working on this, because some words I thought were strictly Nigerian, but we found evidence that these words are used in Ghana, for instance, that I've mentioned. There is a lot of socio-cultural relationship between Ghana. And then if there's evidence that that word is used in Ghana, then it becomes inaccurate to label that word Nigerian. So in that case, that word is labeled West African. So that even though we are going, you see East African English there, because there's been found to be some kind of affinity between the national varieties used in East Africa, so that what you're going to have there is that words that appear in several countries will be labeled East African English, while specific ones like Tanzania, appearing only in Tanzania, will be labeled Tanzanian English.
Okay, clear.
Yeah. Right. I don't know if I could proceed and talk about the second question, right?
Soup.
Which is about this egusi soup, right? Now, what soup? What, for instance, the British people or the British what means in British English might be slightly different, not so well, maybe significantly different from what a Nigerian would call soup, for instance. Now, English soup is quite watery, as I just mentioned, which is unlike what we have. So that's one area of confusion, as I noted during the presentation. So generally, what we tended to see, to a Nigerian, these words are primarily Nigerian English words. For instance, Okada. Let's use Okada. A speaker of British English who lives here in the UK might not have need to use that word, Okada, because it is not in the person's daily reality. But someone who lives in Nigeria knows what this word means and uses it because it appears in the person's linguistic English repertoire, so to speak. So these words primarily were defined to capture the linguistic reality and the sociocultural reality of the Nigerian people. So what Nigerians call soup, as you would know, is tend to be significantly different from what soup means in the British English.
So the key word here is egusi. Egusi is the word being defined. So
yes.
Using soup in a sense peculiar or distinct to Nigerians, now kind of it's like you're now talking about two different terms and not one. Egusi is the word being defined. Perhaps there should be some kind of extra explanation that soup is used here in the Nigerian sense, and maybe you gloss it with words like, say, sauce or stew, so that non-Nigerians would understand the concept better. Because soup, the way it is in, I say, Europe, would be like a type of soup in Nigeria and not soup generally, because what they call soup in Europe is just similar to what we call pepper soup, though with a lot of pepper and so on. I don't know whether I'm clear.
Yeah,
Just a suggestion.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, and the third question is in the pronunciation of Mama Put.
I don't know if Catherine still is on the line and would like to comment on that pronunciation question.
I've just unmuted you.
Yeah, well, it's I can't get into the sort of the details of specific pronunciations because this isn't my talk and I haven't got the information here, but I'll certainly take a look. As a more general point, it's when we get people in, when we hire actors to make the recordings, we're careful to make sure that they speak the relevant variety of English, of course, but they are an individual person, so they will of course have their own individual linguistic profile, their own mother tongues and so forth, and it's not always logistically possible to get, for instance, for a set of less than 100, I think, words of Nigerian English to find a speaker who also who's one of whose first languages is Yoruba, another one who with Hausa and so forth. Having said that, we do like to try to cover that as much as we can with the speakers that we use. So, for instance, in our South African English, we have 2 different speakers made the recording, one of whom was a native speaker also of Afrikaans and the other not. And so we have that variety there as you know, to widen the scope. The other thing that's important to say is the sound recording is, of course, a phonetically specific recording of an individual speaker, but the transcription is phonemically more broad, and the idea is you can see the transcription for a more general account of how that word is pronounced in the variety as a whole, whereas the individual speaker is an example of one specific person doing it. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much, Catherine.
Simone, just before we move on, I would just like to clarify one thing. Going back, going a few questions back, if you remember, Kingsley and I were talking about how spelling variants are also reflected in the OED. So what we choose as the head word, the spelling variant that we choose as the head word, as Kingsley was correct in stating that it's the most frequent one, that's the spelling variant, that's why it's chosen as the head word. But in the variant section, the variants are not ranked by frequency of use. They are in order of, they are in chronological and alphabetical order. So just so there we don't give the false impression that the order of the variants or somehow reflect frequency of use. No, it's there. They are in chronological and alphabetical order. So just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you, Danica. Thanks for clarifying this point. So I'm now going to unmute Sandra Boateng.
Okay, thank you very much. So my name is Sandra Boateng, and I'm from Ghana. And I would like to say that this is a very nice presentation. Thank you very much. I've been enlightening. My first question is, I would like to ask if there are any up-and-coming projects based on Ghanaian English.
Not at the moment, but our work has, is that the question? Can I answer now?
Yeah, no, and the second question is, I do agree with Mr. Kingsley that there are certain words in Nigerian English that can be found in Ghanaian English. For instance, Nigerians do say Okada, and then Ghanaians also, we know what Okada is and we do pronounce it. So I would like to say that that's a very good thing that he mentioned. And also, I think this has already been said, that the pronunciation is different, because in Ghana, I realize that there are certain words in the OED that are are pronounced totally different. Because, for instance, I realize that we have chocho and then we have kwashiorkor, but when the OED pronounce it, it's totally different.
Sorry, what are the words?
The words are chocho,
Mm-hmm.
chocho, which means a minivan used in Ghana to convey people from one place to another. It's pronounced chocho, but the OED pronounce it chocho, which is not what we say in Ghana. So I had a problem with that, although it has already been said that probably the people that they are using might have different accents or whatever, but I think that it should be at least a little genuine to how Ghanaians pronounce it if it is going to be titled Ghanaian English, because we do pronounce it as cho, and then we have kwashiorkor, which we all know as a disease which will be due to lack of protein found in a person, but it is pronounced as kwashiorkor on the OED, which is totally different.
Well, thank you. So just to answer your first question regarding Ghanaian English projects. So at the moment, there's no planned specific project on Ghanaian English, but as Kingsley has mentioned, in our work on Nigerian English, there are certain things that have come up that are that are also related to Ghanaian English. So we have recorded that information. So I do see the opportunity to do some more Ghana specific work in the OED in the future. And as for that pronunciation observation, we will check that and see if.
Yeah. Can I just add in relation to the pronunciation? Right. Now, one thing should be noted there. For instance, the kwashoko you mentioned, I just checked now, and if you're like the pronunciations editor mentioned, if you look at the phonemic transcription, what I see here is kwashoko, which is quite close to how it is pronounced. But remember that this word is no longer strictly West African word. Of course, you can even see here that in the OED that it's not marked West African, which is to say that even in standard English varieties like British English and American English, the word is now being used. And OED tend to prioritize how this word, if British speakers are beginning to use this word, how do they pronounce it, for instance? So this also matters. So that you, even though this word originates from Ghana, certainly from the early 20th century, you will see that it is moving to mainstream English, and the phonemic rules and the phonotactics of English would have to apply to it, so to speak, and that is something that must be taken into consideration. So it's no longer treated, for instance, kwashoko, as strictly Ghanaian English word, and that would necessarily affect the pronunciation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Catherine, in case you'd like to add something, I've left you unmuted.
I was, well, simply to say, I think in Danica's presentation, she mentioned the what can be seen on the OED pages online. So if you go to the page for the West African English model, there's some specific discussion about Ghanaian English, for instance, there, and there's some references to the sociolinguistic research on which the model is based down at the bottom. So if anybody wants to take a look at that, please do. But I'm really interested to hear feedback. These models are dynamic, so anything that we can do to polish them is always really good to hear about. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. We'll make sure to share the link with everyone when we share the recording of the webinar.
Yeah, and I'd also just like to add, with regard to that, and since this is our last question that we're answering, I'd just like to pick up on what Catherine said, that this is dynamic. So I guess I'd just like to stress that our World English work is a work in progress. It is dynamic and changing, so we are really open for anybody, particularly suggestions from researchers on how we can improve this work. And yeah. So
thank you very much, Danica. So I'm afraid we'll have to wrap up now. I know that many of you have sent in questions through the chat box, so we'll pass all these questions to the panelists and we'll be sharing them with the responses when we share the recording of the webinar. So many thanks for sending all the questions, and my apologies that we won't have time to address them all here, and also my apologies if there was anyone with their hands raised that we missed. So I would like to say a huge thank you to Danica and Kingsley for a brilliant presentation, and a thank you to Catherine as well for your help with the pronunciation questions. Thank you everyone for attending. I hope you enjoyed it. So if Danica and Kingsley, if you don't have anything to add, I think it's all from us for now.
I would just like to thank you as well to you, Simone, for moderating today, and thank you, Catherine, for pronunciation.
Thank you so much, Simone, and thanks everyone for attending. Thank you so much, Danica, as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Kingsley.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, and goodbye, everyone.
Yeah. Bye.